Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As the opening ceremony for the Summer Olympics kicks off in Tokyo today in a mostly empty stadium, COVID-19 cases linked to the Games have risen to 110. 13 athletes are among the positive cases. The majority of Tokyo residents oppose the Olympics going ahead amidst a surge of coronavirus. We'll have the latest after headlines. In other coronavirus news, Italy has introduced a green pass, which restricts entry to stadiums, museums, theaters, indoor restaurants, and other social gathering places to only vaccinated people. Here in the U.S., Centers for Disease Control and Prevention Director Dr. Rochelle Walensky warned the United States is at another pivotal moment in the pandemic, urging unvaccinated people yet again to get inoculated to protect themselves and their communities. Hospitals in areas with the largest spikes in cases are warning things are likely to get much worse. This is Eric Frederick, Chief Administrative Officer at Mercy Hospital in Missouri.
You're just starting to see this in your community, and your vaccination rates are low, like ours. You can expect this to go beyond what you saw last year. The Delta variant is much more contagious. It's making people sicker. It's getting into a younger population. There's a lot less mitigation in place than last year.
Just 3 states, Missouri, Texas, and as well Florida, represent 40% of the new infections. Meanwhile, in California, Los Angeles officials said 20% of new cases are now being reported in vaccinated people as the Delta variant has taken hold. In more sports news, the NFL is ramping up pressure on all players to get vaccinated, saying teams will have to forfeit games and players will go unpaid if there is a COVID-19 outbreak among unvaccinated team members. The Biden administration's imposed new sanctions on Cuba's defense minister and the Interior Ministry, with President Biden warning, quote, "This is just the beginning." The move comes in response to recent anti-government protests denouncing the economic crisis during the pandemic and reports of government repression. People have been scrambling to cope amid shortages of medicine, food, and other resources, largely due to catastrophic U.S. sanctions. The Cuban foreign minister, Bruno Rodriguez, denounced the sanctions as unfounded and slanderous and said the U.S. should enforce such measures on itself instead, quote, because of daily acts of police repression and brutality. This comes as over 400 politicians, intellectuals, clergy members, artists, activists, and former heads of state are calling on Biden to immediately lift the 243 sanctions the Trump administration imposed on Cuba. The group, which includes former Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, Noam Chomsky, and Cornel West, printed a full-page ad in today's New York Times headlined, "Let Cuba Live." Congressmember and Congressional Black Caucus Whip Hank Johnson was arrested Thursday, alongside prominent African-American voting rights advocates as they protested ongoing attacks on democracy in front of a Senate building. Harvard professor, former NAAC president Cornell William Brooks, Black Voters Matter co-founder Cliff Albright, and Color of Change President Rashad Robinson were also among the arrested. Before their arrests, the men were joined by other activists and Black Congress members on the steps of the Supreme Court, where they called for abolishing the filibuster and for senators to pass the For the People Act. This is Rashad Robinson speaking yesterday.
Don't come to us and ask us for our vote by day and stay silent where they take away our power by night. Right. We will not go back. And I want to say that there were no good old days. There is only a path forward. Right. There is only a path forward with all of us being able to be heard, recognized, and visible.
In India, over 200 farmers led a protest near the parliament in New Delhi Thursday, marking some 8 months of resistance against 3 pro-corporate agricultural laws enacted by Prime Minister Narendra Modi. farmers are continuing to pressure Modi's government to repeal the laws which deregulate agricultural markets and roll back key labor and income protections. Millions of farmers and opponents of the reforms have staged multiple strikes across India since at least last November. Agriculture is the leading source of income for more than half of India's 1.3 billion population. In South Africa, the death toll in recent anti-government protests has risen to at least 337 people. Thousands of others have been arrested. The demonstrations erupted after former President Jacob Zuma began his 15-month jail sentence for refusing to testify in a corruption probe. They've since focused on grinding poverty and record levels of unemployment exacerbated by the pandemic. At least 20 refugees are presumed to have drowned off the coast of Libya in the Mediterranean Sea Wednesday. This week alone, the Libyan Coast Guard has intercepted 7 vessels and apprehended hundreds of refugees, including children, as they attempt to reach Europe for safety. Amnesty International reports that in the first half of this year, over 7,000 refugees have been apprehended and forcibly returned to prison camps in Libya. Meanwhile, the number of refugees who've died while attempting to reach European soil by sea has more than doubled compared to the first 6 months of 2020. So far this year, over 1,100 people have perished. The Pentagon says it launched overnight airstrikes against Taliban targets in Kandahar, Afghanistan, Thursday. U.S. officials say they'll continue to conduct airstrikes until they complete their withdrawal at the end of August, and that most of the recent strikes in Afghanistan come from unmanned drones. In related news, the U.S. House overwhelmingly passed a bill Thursday to provide 8,000 more special visas for Afghans who worked as interpreters, contractors, and security personnel for the U.S. during its occupation. The visas will also cover their families. The Senate Armed Services Committee voted to increase the Pentagon budget by $25 billion above President Biden's request, in a move likely to face opposition from progressive Democrats who are seeking to cut military spending. Activists gathered in front of the Cultural Attaché Office for the United Arab Emirates in Washington, D.C. Thursday to protest the planned rendition of former Guantanamo prisoner Ravil Mingazov back to Russia. He's currently being held in a UAE prison after being released from Guantanamo Bay in 2017, where he was held without charge for over 15 years. Advocates say 17 other former Guantanamo prisoners now locked up in the UAE under inhumane conditions. This is Helen Schiedinger of Witness Against Torture.
They've been tortured. These men will live with that for the rest of their lives. We owe them reparations. We need to make sure that they are in good situations and continue to follow them and support them in attempting to make the rest of their lives fulfilled.
40 labor, healthcare, and other advocacy groups are calling on President Biden to invoke the Defense Production Act to halt the shutdown of the largest U.S. generic drugs plant at the end of this month. 1,500 people are on the verge of losing their jobs at Viatris Mylan's pharmaceuticals plant in West Virginia, which will start outsourcing its manufacturing to India. The groups say the move will leave the U.S. with virtually no domestic production of generic pharmaceuticals, threatening the supply chain for essential drugs. The House Committee on Financial Services held one of its first hearings on public banking this week. New York Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who last year introduced the Public Banking Act with Congressmember Rashida Tlaib, said public banks would help support local economies and infrastructure and help combat inequality and structural racism in the banking industry. But most states and cities have to rely on commercial banks because there's no public option. This is Deyanira Del Rio from the New Economy Project testifying at Wednesday's hearing.
A public bank would be chartered to serve the public good, and it would remove the profit-seeking shareholders from the equation and allow for other benefits other than maximizing profits.
And a public bank ostensibly wouldn't have, billionaire CEOs that are paid hundreds or thousands times the amount that their lowest employees are made. Is that correct?
Yes, that's certainly our vision for public banking.
And UNESCO's World Heritage Committee has decided not to list or designate Australia's Great Barrier Reef as being in danger. Australia has been feverishly lobbying to avoid the label, which would have meant the site is at risk of losing its World Heritage status. Extreme ocean temperatures due to the climate crisis have caused the reef to degrade, including extensive coral bleaching. UNESCO's decision will be reconsidered in 2022. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.